Hello and welcome everyone to this UJ Philosophy Colloquium webinar. Today our speaker is Dr. Jonathan O. Chimakonam from the University of Pretoria in South Africa. He is a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy, University of Pretoria. He has authored, co-authored, edited and co-edited many articles, chapters, entries and books across different areas in philosophy and interdisciplinary studies. Besides the formation of the system of Ezumizu logic and the colonial method of conversational thinking, he is a major proponent of the theory of conversational philosophy. He is also the president of the it's the word I should know how to pronounce, the Conversational School of Philosophy. And his talk today is titled Two Concepts of Unkali. In this talk, he will discuss two types of an idea called Nkali, which roughly translates to psycho-subordination. He will argue that every individual is a purveyor of Ike or power, whether actual or imagined, controlled by that individual's regulating consciousness called Onwe. Nkali is an abuse of Ike aimed solely at subordinating a victim. But unlike the other principal tropes, such as epistemic injustice and epistemic marginalization, the perpetrator of Nkali is also an unwitting victim. Combining innocent Asuzu's Super Maxim with his newly formulated Under Maxim, Chimakonam will present a radical vision for the philosophical psychology of othering. Dr. Chimakonam, very honored to have you here. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Ashil. And thank you, every one of you who has been able to join us from different places. I hope you are doing well in these dire times. We are hoping that humanity, as always, will prevail over germs. So I will talk on the topic, two concepts of Nkali. Perhaps will give you an idea of some of the points that I will be making today. Let me highlight a few questions that will lead my discussion. Number one, what is it that drives the evolution of the human intellect? Whilst physical evolution may have stalled, I believe strongly that humanity can be better than it is at the moment. I believe that intellectual evolution is continuing. And I will in this talk identify two factors that drive that process. And I am talking about selfish interests and the drive to exhibit power in pursuit of those interests. Number two, is ordering a strategy to stall the intellectual evolution of the people? You know, there are very many ways that ordering could emerge. It could be in the category of sex, or religion, or race, or class, and so on, where an individual or group of persons who believe that some other individuals or group of persons' selfish interests are at a crossroad with their own selfish interests. And as a result, they feel entitled to exhibit power in such a way that will enable them triumph. So the more you exhibit power in pursuit of your selfish interests, my theory suggests, the more powerful you become. If you lose in that game of power and glory, your power is likely going to be diminished. So it's a vortex, it's a wheel of evolution. And because of our selfish interests, we are constrained to always exhibit power in pursuit of those interests. Number 3, is it possible that victims and villains, by the way, 2 characters of ordering. In any program of ordering, the 2 main characters that are usually identifiable are villains and victims. Villains are usually taken to be those who are exhibiting power to subordinate and residualize orderness. Victims are usually conceived as those who are at the receiving end of a reckless exhibition of power to subordinate and subdue them. So this question seeks to ask whether it is possible to conceive of victims and villains as products of a botched evolutionary attempt. Okay, these are the questions that will lead my discussion today. Once again, I welcome every one of you. My name is J.O. Chimakonam. Shall we begin? Okay, so one thing that I'd like to say is that my philosophy, my thoughts are shaped by the approach to philosophizing that was developed in the Calabar School. The Calabar School is a school of philosophy, specifically African philosophy, that developed at the University of Calabar. And actors in this school have put forward very many ideas and new concepts and theories. I can mention a number of them, from Pantaleon Irebu to Innocent Asuzu, to Emayedet's host of them, Victor Mweke, Adagad, and the rest of them. There are G.O. Zumba, Chris Ijoma, and very many others. So to be able to understand the approach to my thinking today, I think it is important to highlight what the approach of the Calabar School is all about. And to do that, I will come from the perspective of a number of concepts. The first one is language. There are those who believe that authentic African philosophy should be done in an African language at least. We do not dispute this, but we believe that the goal of putting out idea is to be able to disseminate the same and influence actions around the world. And due to the conspiracy of events in history, it is not immediately possible to have an African language that is widely spoken, at a global level. As a result of that, and because concepts are the key ingredients of philosophy, we in the Calabar School prioritize formulating and framing our concepts in indigenous African languages, even though we go ahead to communicate them using some other widely spoken languages. But it is our hope that at some point in the future, African philosophy will be done in African languages. Number 2, logic. Our preferred system of logic is a trivalent one. And this is not to suggest that we are opposed to bivalent system. No, we see trivalence as an extension of bivalence.
Sorry, Dr. Chimakonam, we
Yes.
can't see your video.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay, so I should. Oh, I see.
There you are.
Can you see me now?
Yes, sorry for the interruption. See you just fine.
Okay. Yes. So a number of actors in the Calabar School are following the gauntlet that C.S. Momo put forward, have been able to develop some traveling systems of logic, and I am talking about harmonious monism that was developed by Chrissy Joma, complementary logic developed by Innocent Asuzu, and Izumezu logic developed by myself. Number 3, reasoning. We appropriate the deductive and inductive reasoning processes, but we go beyond this to a type of reasoning process that is undergirded by a travelling system of logic. And one model that we adopt for this purpose is aromaristics. Aromaristics could be viewed as a kind of imperfect dialectics because it does not accommodate or promote the synthesis. The 4th, tradition. Our tradition is conversational and our perspective is African. Our objective always at all times is to put forth something original, something that will advance human thinking, something that will extend the frontiers of knowledge. So we may criticize, we may engage, we may deconstruct, but above all else, we always end up putting forth something original. And our methods, at least 3 methods have been developed in the Calabar School. Complementary reflection, integrative humanism, and conversational thinking. For conversational thinking, there have been many questions around the continent and beyond as to how to really produce a summary of what this method of thinking is all about. Well, we have been able to develop a diagram, a schema, something that gives a bird's eye perspective to what conversational thinking as a method is. And we call it the CT octopus. The CT octopus comprises of what we call the 8 postulates of conversational thinking and the 6 pillars of conversational thinking. This is really not my focus today, but it is something that is important to mention. So the takeaways that my viewers will go with at the end of this talk, it is my hope that they will understand the centrality of selfish interest and power in human intellectual evolution. Also, it is my hope that they would understand how the villain and the victim, 2 main characters in any program of ordering, are products of a botched evolutionary attempt and are both victims of their own plots in what I designate as theater of the vanquished. I will come back to this later in the talk. Also, in this talk, I'll show how my analysis of power reveals a new type of ordering that can be viewed as a mental condition requiring psychoanalytic solution rather than mere education or orientational change that are usually recommended for certain, if not all, forms of ordering. Last but not least, I hope that my viewers would understand how the evolution of the human mind could move the human species from Homo sapiens to what I designate as Homo enigma, the enigmatic being. Nowadays, roboticists and geneticists are striving to produce different forms of artificial intelligence, robots that can do the unthinkable, human beings that are bereft of moral failings in the form of moral enhancement and what have you. These are all good ideas, but Isn't it possible that as human beings, we can organically develop ourselves, advance this present existential station to a higher level? It is a question that I will probe in this talk. So to begin with, very many scholars have talked about power, human beings, society. I will not go into rehashing what they have said, but there are quite a few that I feel it's important that I mention. The first three are elements of the Calabar school, chiefly because all of us are influenced by the same tradition, and we apply the same methodology. And the next person that I will highlight his view would be Friedrich Nietzsche. So for members of the Calabar school, let me begin by mentioning Pantaleon Irebu, who in his books of 1994 and 1995, titled Wisdomization and African Philosophy and the Theme of Metaphysics, try to conceive the universe as one, a place where human beings like you and I exist, but whose primary aspiration, evolutionary aspiration, is to become what he calls the etisophontic being. And the way to do that is to strive to grow in wisdom and try to put that wisdom into action to attain what he calls the totality of goodness. A being that has attained the totality of goodness for Irebu is the etisophontic being. And for Irebu, the etisophontic being would represent the end of human intellectual evolution. Innocent Asuzu, in his books, his theory of Hebrew and gender ontology, published a number of treatises where he conceived this universe really as a universe characterized by binary complementarity. And that when individuals are not aware of this, have not reached the consciousness of complementary thinking, they tend to act in ways that oppose their collective interests. And so the aspiration of individuals in this universe is to attain the consciousness of complementary thinking. And a being that has done that is a being he describes as Onyemonweya, the complementary being. Moving forward, Adagada, in his recent treatise on consolation philosophy, put forward what he calls the melancholy being as really the circumstantial, acceptable end of the human intellectual evolution. He believes that the universe is characterized by mood, the mood of joy and mood of sadness. The aspiration of individuals in this universe is to avoid sadness and reach the joy of being. However, because the universe is not perfect, its purpose of perfection becomes impossible. But the purpose of human being, which is attainment of meaning, is not impossible, even though it is not something that is can be reached on a permanent basis. Someone who reaches joy today could drop once again. So for Adagada, in the effort to reach joy, if the individual misses that target, the individual lands at consolation. All right? And so the melancholy being becomes the circumstantial end or acceptable outcome of the aspirations of human beings in the universe as they attempt to exhibit power, to pursue their interests and reach their purpose. Okay, so, but how is my view different from all these views? Perhaps before I do that, let me also highlight that of Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche found the works of the evolutionary thinkers very interesting, that he read Herbert Spencer copiously, and Herbert Spencer identified the instinct of self-preservation as the goal of human evolution. Nietzsche, who read Spencer copiously, rejected this. The overall attempt really is for Nietzsche is to give an account of how life emerged from inanimate matter and how evolution has continued at intellectual level, even if not at physical level. And so he accepted evolution as something that is ongoing at a psychological level, but criticized the evolutionists for holding the view that preservation is the goal of human evolutionary quests. Nietzsche, in his Thus Spake Zarathustra, attributed this idea to Charles Darwin, but it was actually Herbert Spencer's interpretation of evolution. Darwin, for one, did not air such a view. What Darwin said was that there are certain advantageous traits that determine which species survive and which one goes extinct. In other words, there are certain advantageous traits are traits that can be passed on through natural selection. In any case, even though Nietzsche attributed his view to Darwin, it enabled him to come up with this idea of the will to power. But the will to power did not just emerge out of nowhere. Nietzsche had read Arthur Schopenhauer, who in his book, The Will and the Idea, talked about the will to live or the will to life, which is really blind and of no aim, as something that drives human evolutionary quests. Nietzsche says no, that it cannot be the will to live, because if it were so, then that drive to act, to exhibit power, can only work when life is threatened. So Nietzsche had to go further to identify the will to power. He says that human beings naturally have this insatiable desire to demonstrate power, But what has stalled the evolution, the psychological evolution of human beings, according to Nietzsche, is that the world has come to be dominated by those he described as herd, members of the herd. These are people who are controlled and inspired by the herd mentality, the bandwagon mentality. And these people are not really aspiring to use power, their will and power, in a way that can advance their intellect. So Nietzsche recommends that the present human being, the regular human being, whom he identified as the last man, has the capacity to evolve into a higher being. That this current human being is a bridge to the higher being that he identifies as the Ubermensch, or the Overman, or the Superman, as you'd like. And that for the Uberman to really emerge, that he has to isolate itself from the herd, because the herd are made up of people who are envious, they are jealous, they don't like the idea of anyone trying to demonstrate that he or she is stronger or superior, and they will claw and pull until they pull you down to their level. So the only way the Ubermensch can emerge is to, first of all, one who has that intention, isolate themselves and begin to practice various forms of discipline aimed at self-overcoming, overcoming their limitations at every stage until they become the Ubermensch, which Nietzsche, according to Nietzsche, in his genealogy of morals, as well as the Beyond Good and Evil, says is the end of human intellectual evolution, the Ubermensch. But I disagree with all these people. For Irebu and Asuzu, who postulates a theophonic and a complementary being as the end of human intellectual evolution, respectively, I believe that they are but different stages, in human evolution, and that beyond the complementary being, we can have what I will discuss much later as the Mwizugbe, the complete being. But even the complete being is not the end of human evolutionary process as Nietzsche postulated Ubermensch. The Mwizugbe is another stage. We must continue to evolve. The human brain has elastic capacity to continue to increase in sophistication. We must explore this. And so I also disagree with the position of Adagada in his melancholy being. I see that as quite pessimistic. Mwizugbe is quite optimistic and self-assured. However, we must understand that undergirding this process of intellectual evolution, as I put it, are the factors of selfish interest and the drive to exhibit power. So in that regard, there's a connection between what Nietzsche and Irebu and Asuzu, as well as Agada, have said with regards to power. Even to Adagada attributes the category of power and glory to God. Mwizugbe, or the theory I put forward here as I articulate this form of ordering called Nkali, is that it is the individuals themselves who have to exhibit power in pursuit of their selfish interests. All right, but the emergence of Mwizugbe in this zone of existence entails an individual who is previously in the heart, but whose own way is actually active and working, because every individual has this internal regulating mechanism that I call Onwe. It is a mechanism that regulates interests, attitudes, beliefs, orientations, and what have you. These are some of the emotions and categories that inspire us to use the power that we have, whether actual or imagined. And Onwe is what regulates the use of that power so that it doesn't become reckless, so that above all else, the exhibition of power strikes the Benoke point. A Benoke point is something, is a concept we translate in English as moderation. But our meaning of moderation is not similar, not to be confused with what has been stated to be the meaning of moderation in the long history of philosophy from the ancient China to Greece and beyond. I will give us our definition of the Benoke point of moderation in the course of this talk. So Mwizugbe is that being that has moved in the wheel of evolution, left the realm of the heart to a higher realm, the realm of higher beings, reach the complementary being, and move beyond the complementary being to evolve as Mwizugbe, the Homo Enigma, or the enigmatic being. And the goal of Mwizugbe is to evolve yet again. So let me explain the zone of existence. The zone of existence can be carved into different arcs, levels. The most dominant level is the zone of the heart, where the regular human beings abound. The aspiration of every individual in this zone is to evolve into the class of higher beings. However, when this attempt to evolve into the class of higher beings is botched as a result of a desperation of individuals whose interests have collided, they again become compelled to violate certain principles, such as the sociological principle and the imperative of the dynamics of power, which I will discuss momentarily. Once they violate these principles, their evolution into the category of higher being becomes botched, and they find themselves dropping to an isolated corner. And those who end up in this regard are the victims and villains. Victims and villains, it is never the purpose of any individual to evolve into a victim or into a villain. But because of the collision of their selfish interests, and because of their inability to engage their own way, to regulate the amount of power they exhibit in excess and in deficit, their goal transforms into ordering, each side attempting to order the other side, to subordinate or subjugate the other side. And instead of evolving into higher beings, like the theosophantic being or the complementary being, for example, they end up evolving into the theater of the vanquished. They end up evolving into villains and victims. So with all this background, what then is Nkali? Nkali has its etymology in the Igbo language. Literally, it means being more powerful than another. It has been applied in international relations and diplomacy by the Igbo writer Chimakonam. But here I bid to conceptualize Nkali as a form of ordering which can be described as a mental condition. So I define Nkali as the reckless exhibition of power, whether at the individual or group levels, in the zone of existence, resulting from a broken onwe, which subordinates not only the otherness, but the self as its victim. So with this in mind, what are the two concepts of Nkali from where I derived the title of this talk? Those two concepts of Nkali are: one, order-directed. Nkali, as you have heard, is a form of ordering. And the first type is order-directed. We can literally translate Nkali as psycho-subordination. And the second type is self-inflicted. Now, the basic assumption of Nkali is that individuals are purveyors of power. Whoever wields it more effectively controls subjectivity. Recall where we are coming from. The influence that selfish interests and the power to pursue those selfish interests have in the intellectual evolution of human beings. So the basic assumption of Nkali is that individuals are purveyors of power. They are constrained to exhibit power. Whoever wields it more effectively is the person that controls subjectivity. This is the mindset that leads to all forms of ordering. All forms of ordering. You will come to understand this clearly when I discuss the dynamics of power that goes on in the zone of existence, where the villain and the victim emerge as a product of botched evolutionary attempts. So, but how do we conceive effectiveness? Do we conceive it as outcome, or do we conceive it as moderation? Again, the concept of moderation, Benoke point, comes up again. I will urge you to be patient to a later passage where I will engage with that. But victims and villains who in an attempt to evolve into higher beings end up evolving into victims and villains, okay, are not really acting arbitrarily. They believe as victims and villains that there are certain principles justify the plots that they act, okay? So these principles are the Under Maxim and the Super Maxim. I formulated the Under Maxim to describe that psychology of the villain, okay? The psychology of the villain. And the Under Maxim can be stated this way: the father, the different and the inferior. All right? The father, the different and the inferior. The psychology of the villain is that those who are far off from them, okay, are different. And that difference means inferiority. All right? And this motivates and justify any kind of action they undertake to subordinate or even dehumanize those who have evolved as victims. And then the second principle, maxim, is the one formulated by Innocent Asuzu, and it is called the Super Maxim. He states it as the nearer, the better, and the safer. Now, the villain, in his exhibition of power in pursuit of his selfish interests, always think that those who are closer are better to be related with, and they are safer, okay? And as a result, they manifest this whether in the category of sex or religion or race, and what have you. It's always the same mentality. It's always the same psychology, okay? So based on the assumption of Unkali, remember the assumption of Unkali, that every individual is a purveyor of power, all right? And those who wield this power effectively control subjectivity. The goal is to control subjectivity in the otherness. So based on this assumption of Unkali, those with broken onwe, the botched evolutionary attempt that led the individual to evolve as a victim or a villain has also broken their onwe, that internal regulating consciousness that guide and regulate the way they exhibit power, whether in excess or in deficit. So that botched evolutionary attempt broke their onwe, made their own way to fail. So the onwe is no longer functioning the way she functioned. It is now working in a negative way. So those with broken onwe adopt these maxims, the under and the super maxim, to undergird the exhibition of power. But these maxims make false and dangerous assumptions. The assumptions are not true. It is not all the time that those who are closer to us are better. It is not all the time that those who are far from us are bad people. And difference does not translate to inferiority. But this is the psychology of these actors, villains and victims. And do not be sympathetic for the victim, because the victim is not just a product of the villain. The victim is also an individual that is acting his own plot. And by so doing, also creates the villain. I will come to that analysis much later. So Unkali, perhaps I should say something about Unkali and other master tropes to show the difference. Master tropes, I mean, things like women marginalization, global epistemic injustice, and other ones put forward by Miranda Africa, testimonial injustice, hermeneutical injustice, and what have you. Whereas Unkali, like these other master tropes, aim at residualizing otherness. Unkali, in addition, is not restricted to the subordination and subjugation of otherness. Unkali also involves the subordination and subjugation of the self. And that is why it is of two kinds. So, but all this that happens in the zone of resistance are described by the dynamics of power. That is what describes how different individuals in the heart who are attempting to evolve into higher beings, all right, utilize power. The dynamics of power, DP, is what explains how that works. So perhaps I should give an elementary conception of power that I'm using here. So by power, I mean the capacity for acting, whether in willing, gesticulation, or judging, and the ability to fulfill the requirements for such acts. So there are two main core items there: capacity and ability. If one can have the capacity to do something, to judge, all right, but may not have the ability to do so. Okay, if one wants to join a march against police brutality, as that is happening in Nigeria, for example, and has the capacity to demonstrate criticism to the police establishment, okay, but needs to get to a point, a certain rendezvous where the protesters would gather, and does not have their means to get there. The person has the capacity, but not the ability. All right, so these dynamics of power have three components: the sociological, the psychological, and the anthropological dimensions. Okay, so these components are undergirded by principles. So the principle one, the sociological principle, states that in the pre-society individual, and I am here recapturing the social contract idea, that before the formation of the first human society, individuals lived free with unlimited freedoms. Okay, so this pre-society individual believes that his existence is inevitably intertwined with the existence of others. Why does he reach this belief, this false belief? It is because he possesses unlimited freedom, and he thinks that the best place to apply this freedom in order to achieve his personal selfish interest is in the community of other people, all right? And when their selfish interests continue to collide, and the exhibition of unlimited freedoms, proves to be tragic and of great consequence, they thought of forming a society and giving themselves some laws to limit the exhibition of such powers. So they begin to assume that the existence are inevitably intertwined, but it's not true. The pre-society individual could have walked away from that contract. He could have walked away from the society, but he chose to, all right? And the reason he gave for that is not true. But because it has entered that contract, it is now bound to honor the terms of that contract, one of which is to tolerate and respect the existence of other individuals. Principle two is a psychological principle that states that the society individual, now no longer the pre-society individual, but the society individual, is wired mentally to think of every relationship it enters into as a game of power and glory. All right? And this type of mentality, inspires the anthropological principle. That is, that the society individual is thus constrained to always act in ways that exhibit or demonstrate power. Because it's either you do something to increase your power, or others will diminish your power. Okay, so the psychological and the anthropological principles are consequences of the sociological principle. So, but there's a fourth principle, okay? And this fourth principle is what explains the psychology of the villain and the victim, those who have been spun out of the evolutionary wheel, all right? They are no longer there, they are stuck somewhere because they violated the sociological principle and violated the imperative of the power dynamics. And that is why their evolution took a detour and landed them somewhere where they are stuck. So, So the fourth principle is the diagnostic principle that states that if a society individual loses self-control through the failure of his own way, certain things are inevitable. One, it becomes a villain or a victim and begins to exhibit power without moderation. That is, in ways that can, one, subordinate other participants, victims, to the power game. That is the first concept of Unkali. Two, consequently, subordinate itself, the villain, as a boomerang effect, what Asuzu calls the boomerang effect of his other directed subordination. All right. So Nkali, again, manifests at a psychological level, different from other master tropes that we discussed, that manifest at epistemological level. Okay? So we come to power and control. Principles 2 and 3, and I'm talking about the psychological and the anthropological principle, explain how the society individual becomes a purveyor of power in a bid to protect and accomplish its selfish interests, all right? Which amongst whom is the evolution to higher being, and what have you. So power then power is then controlled externally by the norms that created the society. But again, because it has its source internally, it also requires an internal mechanism that I have called onwe to regulate its use. When onwe fails, either through miseducation or bad orientation, bad education, abuse, indoctrination, these are the kinds of things that lead to the failure of onwe. All right? Instead of evolving to higher beings, actors evolve to villains and victims. Okay? And begin to demonstrate a program of ordering against different groups and different peoples. So villains and victims. These people were formerly in the heart and aspiring to evolve to higher being. And like I explained, their reckless use of power, violating the sociological principle and the imperative of DP, spun them out of will of resistance and entraps them in the island I call the theater of Vanquished, where they act out plots that continuously aim at destroying one another. So the emergence of the villain and the victim is an evolutionary mistake. Nobody plans to be a victim or a villain. It's something that happens when they violate those principles. What then is the theater of the vanquished? Villains and victims perform different plots, okay, in the same script. Let's imagine theater of vanquished as a place where actors perform script roles. Okay, that's a script, and villains perform different plots in the same script. And this script is Nkali. Think of those plots as the two types of Nkali, okay, the order directed and the self-inflicted. So once an individual is entrapped in the theater of the vanquished, there is a slim chance of getting away. Once you become a villain or a victim, there's a slim chance of regaining yourself again. You are in there, self-destructing all the way. So inside the villain, there's also the victim, because the table could turn. And I will use the history of the apartheid South Africa to demonstrate and practice these ideas that I am putting forward here. So, but let's try to understand the structure of the theater of the vanquished. Okay, we can imagine an island theater in front of which is a vast sea leading to the zone of higher beings. Okay, and behind it is a narrow river infested by flesh-eating fish, leading to the zone of the heart, leading back to the zone of the heart. And the victim and the villain were people who left the heart because they wanted to get to the zone of the higher being. So they are stuck here. They can't swim the vast seas, and they can't make it back alive through the narrow sea because of the flesh-eating fish. So occupants of the gallery in this theater, okay, and the stage are both actors. Okay, and that is surprising because the actors are supposed to be on the stage and the audience will be on the gallery. But in the theater of the vanquished, occupants of the gallery and the occupants of the stage are both actors. Between them is a giant bale or script hanging on a spinning pole. Each sheet contains different plots, such that when those at the stage look at us, the side facing them, they see a different plot that they act. Those at the gallery look at the side of the sheet facing them, it contains a different plot entirely that they act. Okay, so there is, now let us also imagine that there is a giant hourglass by the side. The last grain of sand in that hourglass will correspond to the last sheet in that script. But the victim and the villain, these actors don't know that. So when the last script is performed, the spinning pole holding the script spins the script such that it begins afresh, but this time around, the page facing the villain was the page that the victim acted in the previous session, and vice versa. So They think that the whole thing is continuing without knowing that they are repeating history over and over again. And they are trapped in it. So, Nkali then is an extreme form of ordering. Example, racism, reverse racism, ethnicism, fundamentalism, apartheid, these are all Nkali, and they are extreme form of ordering when compared, for example, the little beef that schoolboys could have, or friends could have, or colleagues could have, and all that. These ones are extreme, and they are psychological. Most manifestations of Nkali start from childhood and graduate to a mental condition properly. So it is not so simple to say that that person is a racist, or that person is a xenophobe, or that person is a fundamentalist, or that person is an ethnic bigot or religious, whatever. These things are mental conditions. And until psychologists recognize this, people who need help will not get that. Okay? Usually you see in scholarship people talking about ethical reorientation. These things will never solve problems of Nkali because they are mental conditions. And I will explain that. What will solve the problem of Nkali is psychoanalysis. Okay? But psychologists are dragging their feet to recognize these forms of ordering. That's mental condition, but that is what they are. And using the case of the apartheid South Africa to explain, to diagnose, okay, Nkali, I would say that that system, or any system of ordering in that category, leaves a lot of people traumatized. And let me use an example of two mentally terrorized children. Okay, let's imagine one child born to the dominant group during the apartheid, and another child born at the same time to the marginalized group during apartheid. Okay, let's imagine how their psychology gets broken eventually through the passage of time. These kids, as they are growing, they are seeing all around them images of information, messages. Even their parents and relatives are telling them about how the other race is a bad race, full of evil people, wicked, mean. All right. Initially, we can imagine, as all children do at the age of 4 or 5, they are curious. They want to meet these people. They want to see these creatures that have been described as such. All right. But with time, as they attain early adolescence, let's say between 8 and 13, these children, curiosity will transform to phobia. All right. These children from these two racial groups will begin to have phobia for people on the other side, all right? And some of them might even begin to have nightmares where boogeymen and monsters looking like people on the other side are haunting them every night, all right? And then by the time they reach late adolescence, they're entering puberty, 14 to 20. They are developing a sense of societal collective consciousness. Okay, national and ethnic and racial loyalty begin to develop at this time. Okay, the little hero within begins to wake. So at this time, such that they not only think of admiring heroes there in sports in different areas, they might even begin to imagine themselves as heroes. All right, and if it is in a normal society, they might begin to imagine when they will become national heroes in sports, all right, in sciences and arts, inventions and what have you. But in a racially divided, racial hotspot, these children would begin to see themselves as the racial heroes, the messiahs that will emerge tomorrow to annihilate members of the other race for their own race. All right. And this psychology grows in them as they cross puberty into their 20s when character is fully formed. All right. As that psychology is growing, phobia is translating to hate. As their character is being formed, the proper racial prejudice takes root. Okay. That may eventually begin to influence everything about their lives. It may influence the choice of course they study in the university. It may influence their choice of career. It can even influence their choice of spouse. All right. People, in the course of this research, I try to track the rate of divorce in apartheid South Africa in the post-1994, it was astronomically high. Why? Because majority are even trapped. South Africans that immigrated to other places like New Zealand, their rate of divorce is astronomically high. Why? Because something brought them together. They shared a common ideal. These were the children that were mentally terrorized. The society, their parents terrorized them. And they grew up having this enormous hate, okay, that it influences everything about their lives. For example, if someone had that a certain supremacist runs a bike club, he doesn't have interest in bike, but he's prepared to go and buy a bike and join that club, because that's where he will find people who resonate with his strong sensations, strong selfish interest, okay? And where he is likely going to have the opportunity to exhibit the power that he wants to exhibit, okay? And that also happens in choice of marriage, in choice of career, even in choice of where people live. If someone had that Limpopo or Stellenbosch or Pretoria, people there are people who believe in their race and are willing to do whatever it takes against those people. That individual is willing to relocate to such a place and live. Now, we must ask ourselves objectively, these children that have grown up imbibing these attitudes, this mental terrorism, are they really well? The answer is not, because everything they do is directed and informed by their internal emotions that have been built up over time. Okay, they are mentally broken. These people cannot exhibit power with moderation. These people cannot pursue legitimate selfish interests, and they will be supported in their thinking and their actions by the psychology of Under Maxim and Super Maxim. Okay, and this eventually, because of the failure of the psychologists to grade forms of ordering, extreme forms of ordering that I'm discussing here as mental conditions, people who are suffer all kinds of post-traumatic stress in the post-apartheid, because when the system collapsed, like the theater of the vanquished, the table turned, all right? Those who were the victims before became the villains, and the villains became the victims, all right? Now, the challenge is this: all through their lives, these people have been prepared to act the plot of victimhood, and those other people prepared to act the plot of villainhood. Now, with the turning of the table, how are they going to cope? They have not been prepared to act the new scripts facing them, all right? And this leads to all forms of trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, collapse of family units, and all kinds of things, okay? It is something I believe and strongly that psychologists today classify these forms of ordering as mental conditions. But it's not far-fetched why they are not doing that, because they are limited by their conditions. Most of the popular psychologists who direct what happens in that field in the world are from the West, okay, from the zones where most people that evolve into villains have performed, all right? So if these psychologists are to classify racism, for example, as a form of mental disorder, how are you sure? Many of them would, when tested, would turn out a positive test for racism. So they are limited by that, much like Alexander the Great, who wanted to conquer the world, but at the fringe of India, his soldiers wanted him to go back. And he didn't want to, because he had all to lose, all right? He didn't have children and wives at home like his soldiers. So he had all to lose. So he denied their proposal. I think of this as a Alexandrian limitation. And that is the same Alexandrian limitation that is preventing the psychologists from classifying ordering like racism, like ethnicism, like fundamentalism as mental conditions. Those are what they are. Those who have recommended ethical reorientation, and even the noetic propedeutic that was propounded by Asuzu of the Calabar School, these things are not good enough and effective enough to resolve any problem associated with these forms of ordering. And we must realize that there could be historical victims and there could be victims of history, okay? Historical victims are those who were on the receiving side during, for example, apartheid, Victory of history are those who were born by parents of the previous victims in the post-apartheid era. These people did not experience the history of apartheid, but they are now learning the history of the apartheid from their parents. And they could, again, through this indoctrination, grow to become violent in resistance, all right, in thinking of every other person around as villains against them. These are victims of history, all right? And we have to put all these things into proper charts in order to begin to, as a society, find creditable solution in psychoanalysis, all right? Millennials in countries like South Africa are on the cusp of history, okay? They are usually the victims of history, okay? So now, as I begin to wrap up very shortly, there is something that ordering really creates. It is the wall between. Every form of ordering builds a wall between, okay? The villains feel that they are safe inside that wall, but it is not true, okay? The order-directed form of Nkali usually erects a wall between villains and victims, okay? The aim of such a wall usually is to keep the victims outside or make them outsiders. But this usually boomerangs, as Asuzu will tell us, that the acts of excessive selfish interest, okay, always lead to self-contradiction, according to Asuzu. So it usually boomerangs because the table can turn and the wall can also entrap the villains, making them prisoners or victims of their own plots. That is the self-inflicted form of Nkali. Okay, empirically, we can think of Donald Trump that built a wall between US and Mexico. First of all, started by ordering them, calling them despicable names, rapists, and what have you, in order to justify the building of that name. That's what villains do, okay, building of that wall. Okay, but then, ding-dong, coronavirus struck. Many people who would have escaped to Mexico to avoid that disease died in thousands because the wall is entrapping them. Okay, but that is by the way. I am discussing this at the psychological level. Okay, so because of the challenge of victims and villains, okay, who missed the proper channel to evolution to higher beings. What then is the proper rite of the passage to be performed in order for one to evolve from the heart to higher being and to even become Muizugbe? Okay, Muizugbe is a complete being, not merely a higher being like a tisophantic and the complementary beings, but a complete being because it consistently strikes the Benoke point in its exhibition of power, something I'll come to momentarily. So the rite of passage into Muizugbe, the evolution from hard to Muizugbe includes one, reaching complementary being. It is important that one reaches the consciousness of complementary thinking, that human beings around are not really enemies, are not enemies to be ordered. They are not different and they are not inferior. Okay, and that those who are close to us are not exactly usually friends and the better. It is the consciousness of not drawing those lines. Okay, any individual that reaches that consciousness is a step away from evolving into Muizugbe. Okay, and Asuzu outlined 4 principles that must guide the action of an individual who is a proper complementary being. The first principle is what he calls the principle of integration. Okay, that states that anything that exists serves a missing link of reality, suggesting that there is nothing that is complete or self-sufficient. The principle number 2, the principle of progressive transformation, that states that all human actions are geared towards the joy of being. Okay, every action you perform, every exhibition of power should be geared towards respecting the sociological principle and, of course, the imperative of the dynamics of power. And then number 3, the Ibuanyidanda imperative, okay, which states allow the limitations of being to be the cause of your joy. And the 4th is the truth and authenticity criterion, which it says is do not never elevate any world immanent missing link to an absolute instance. Any being that abides by these principles is a complementary being, yet a step away from evolving into Mwizube. Okay? So to evolve into Mwizube, one has to follow the complementary rules consistently. And Mwizube then is one that whose action, exhibition of power in pursuit of his own interest always strikes the Benoke point. Okay, the idea of moderation of Benoke point has been a part of the long history of philosophy, like I said. All right, but most of the ideas of moderation geometrically, okay, point to a midpoint between a length, moderation. Okay, it's been even conceptualized by Plato as a cardinal virtue, one of the 4 cardinal virtues. The Christian religion has also adopted that, and so on. Some principles in ethics, like the golden mean, the golden rule, have also been formulated from the idea of moderation. Okay, but in terms of the exhibition of power, our idea of moderation is not what comes to the middle as such. Okay, for example, it's not half force, half gentility, or equal force, equal gentility. No, our definition of Benoke point is this. Benoke point or moderation is the ratios of excess and deficit of power necessary for the context and sufficient for the objective of an act. Okay, we can even put this into a kind of mathematical formulation to have a formula as M equals bracket A plus C close bracket multiplied by bracket A plus O over NS, where M stands for Benoke points or the moderation, A for act, C for context, O for objective of the act, N and S stand for necessity and sufficiency respectively. So as I be to conclude, when faced with a choice on how to exhibit power with moderation in a given scenario, Mwizube in a split second calculates the ratios of excess and deficit of power necessary for the context of that action, and again, sufficient for the realization of the objective of that act. Okay? So, and that is the perspective to this, my talk on, broad perspective to this, my talk on the 2 concepts of Nkali. So in conclusion, I have projected selfish interest and power as the drivers of human intellectual evolution. I have projected, explained villains and victims as products of botched evolution from hard to higher being. I have theorized on an extreme form of ordering that results as a result of this botched attempt that gave birth to victims and villains, and call that form of ordering Nkali, and I have explained 2 types of it. And I have recommended that psychologists should classify ordering as a form of mental condition, because that is what it is. I have also discussed the dangers of Nkali in the modes of villains and victims. I have remapped the future evolutionary trajectory of the human mind from Homo sapiens to Homo enigma, that is Mwizube, and offered Mwizube, the Homo enigma, as the being which roboticists and geneticists are trying to model in the forms of AIs and moral enhancement. But we can do that organically. All right, I'll stop here and take your questions and comments. Thank you very much, all of you who have made out time to join and listen to me. Thank you very much, Ashil and the Department of Philosophy, University of Johannesburg. Over to you, Ashil.
Thank you. Thanks for your excellent talk. So just a reminder, we have about right now about 20 minutes for Q&A, and that this is being recorded and it's live on YouTube. So you can share the link with your friends at UJ Library, who are hosting this event in coordination with UJ Philosophy. First round of questions. Can I encourage PGs, postgraduate students, or even undergraduate students? Please questions or comments, you can raise your hand. There's a hand raising function. You can use a microphone, or you can type into the chat box. Time's up, students. Everybody now can ask questions or comments, including students. Students for life and registered students. Veli Matova, your hand is up. You may go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Jonathan. Welcome to UJ. Good to see you again.
Veli, how are you doing? Good to see you again.
Good. Thank you for your very, very rich talk. I'm not sure that I followed all the details because it's quite complicated, all this, but yeah, awesome. Yeah. So I have a kind of general question, and that is about the whole idea of conceiving of this as a botched attempt, evolutionary attempt, right? And that seems to me to take away the responsibility from the villains, right? So there's almost like a tension, right? On the one side, we telling a very kind of causal evolutionary story, but on the other side, on the other hand, we're using normatively charged vocabulary that presupposes that victims and villains especially have a choice about this and are responsible for these injustices. So I was wondering how you resolve that tension, or whether I've just misunderstood. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Elena. Yes, your point is apt, except that it does not take away the responsibility. That botched evolutionary attempt does not take away the responsibility that accrues to the villain. All right. In fact, what that process also suggests or states is that even the victim has accrues responsibility too, okay, because both of them are exhibiting power recklessly, in a wrong way, in a way that it shouldn't be exhibited, okay, and that is what led to their evolution as villains and victims, all right? So unlike what is common knowledge out there, the victim is always the one who gets the stage to tell their story, who is pitied, a global avalanche of commiserations and all that, but that is not the case. The victim is also a cautious individual that is acting out a plot, okay? And that plot includes a way of demonizing the villain, a way of preventing the villain from reaching his selfish goal by his exhibition of power, which again compels the villain to become much more irrational, much more unrestricted in his exhibition of power. So both of them are people who are acting plots, different plots, plot of aggression and plot of resistance in the same script, and must show that the responsibilities of their acts, that is why they got spun out from the wheel of evolution in the zone of existence. It's unfortunate that I did not have any slides to show for some of these things in order to convey a clearer picture and image of some of these ideas that I have engaged with. So we are not saying that because they've been spun out of the wheel of evolution and it looks as if things are not going so well for them, then they should not face responsibility that accrues for them. And they must. That is why they are down there. That's why they are stuck between the vast seas and the river containing the flesh-eating fish. They are stuck there. It's a punishment. It's retribution. It's what also calls the boomerang effect of their action, where excessive acts of self-interest leads to self-contradiction. They shoulder the responsibility of their actions completely. Thank you very much, Alena.
Thank you.
You're on mute.
Sorry. I'm going to go first to Arabio Atto. I see the hands raised. Arabio, you can go first.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Jonathan, for your very interesting talk. My question is a simple one. Well, not really simple. The will to power appears to be a natural inclination. This is the case whether you're a victim or a villain. because once capacity meets ability, power play is inevitable. That's what I think. And this is why the victim of a power play, seriously or she, has the ability to also power play, for instance, subjugating his or her spouse or terrorizing his or her children. Now, like all things natural, rational and purpose is an illusion. So there's no rhyme or reason to the universe. So having a purpose is not possible. If this is true, what real reason can we give to moderating power or subjugating the self? After all, it is only natural for one to express power. If there is a reason, what is it? If this reason involves stemming power, as it usually does, doesn't it weaken the individual? Thank you.
Fantastic, Arabia. Thank you very much. And by the way, Arabia is also an element of the Calabar School. Okay, great question, Arabia. From the beginning of my talk, I don't know if you were able to join from the beginning, I explained that physical evolution may have stalled, but intellectual, psychological evolution is still continuing. And two factors that drive that process include one, selfish interest, and two, the drive to exhibit power in pursuit of those interests. All right. Now we want to evolve. That's the reason. That's the whole point. Okay, the human being is driven to evolve into higher forms, into higher intellectual forms. That's the whole point of this evolution. And to do that, one must have to nurture interests, all right, and exhibit the amount of power that is adequate, that strikes the Benoke point in order to reach those selfish interests. When one is able to do that, one is evolving, one is increasing in power, and one is evolving, all right? It is only Muzube that can consistently do that. But there are other forms of higher being, like the Asozo's complementary being, and there are principles that an individual have to uphold consistently. Principle of integration, progressive transformation, principle of Ibuaidanda imperative, and the truth and authenticity criterion. Once an individual is able to uphold these principles, such an individual has evolved into a complementary being. Okay, the same goes for the Tisophontic being of Pantaleon Irebu. These are forms of higher being, but the victim and the villain, who in an attempt to move from the hard and evolve into any form of higher being, and that evolution was truncated because of the collision of their interests and their inability to regulate their exhibition of power. And I say that there's an internal regulation consciousness called Dongwe that regulates these interests, these attitudes, orientations, beliefs, all right? When their interests collide and each side is bent on coming out on top, they tend to violate the sociological principle that created society in the first place, all right? Requiring everyone to tolerate others. And the imperative of the dynamics of power that demand that everyone must exhibit power in moderation instead of recklessly, all right? Once they violate that, their evolution is truncated and diverted, okay? Instead of evolving as the Tisophontic being or a complementary being, they evolve as victims and villains, all right? So it is in pursuit of evolution into higher beings that lead the victims and the villains to where they are. Unfortunately, the only thing that can lead them back, because they can't go forward from there, they must go back to the heart and start afresh. The only thing that can do that is psychoanalysis. That is a kind of a guidance through that narrow river infested by flesh-eating fish, a guidance by a specialist that knows his contours to avoid those flesh-eating fish and safely return to the heart as a regular human being. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. I think what we're going to do is we're going to get questions from the audience, just to give them a chance to speak, because our discussion period is running to an end. So I'll give each of the three questioners a chance to speak their question, and then we'll go over to you. So firstly, we have XT1585. Go ahead and please try to be as brief as possible. XT1585. That's how you're listed. I'm going to skip XT and we're going to go to Augustine A. Augustine A, your question, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Jonathan.
Thank you, Augustine.
Yeah, my interest, or what kept me through your presentation, was the point of psychological solution, what you call psychoanalysis, to the problem of ordering. Yeah, but at the end, or the way you concluded, you talked about the emergence of the Nwezube, which is strongly connected to your understanding of the Binoke point. Now, I'm trying to ask, or perhaps I'm asking, don't you think that the Binoke point is very much still clothed in ethical reorientation? That's my question.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Augustine. Perhaps I should clarify the points I made in those places further. Binoke point is not a solution. It's not a proposal to a solution, all right? The problem is ordering, all right? And the solution proposed for this ordering, which is a psychological, which is something that manifests at the level of psychology, as opposed to other master tropes like epistemic marginalization, all those ones that manifest at the epistemological level, but Nkali manifests at the psychological level. And my diagnosis of two imaginary South African children born to different races, supposed races during the apartheid, shows how Nkali could actually, someone could actually grow to be so traumatized that Nkali becomes a psychological disorder when he begins to influence and determine that individual's actions, all right? In such a way that the individual does not, again, live to fulfill the ultimate goal of evolving into higher intelligence by exhibiting power in moderation to actualize such interests, okay? So, Nwezube is not a solution to the problem. It is what happens when an individual is able to avoid evolving in a deformed way, evolving into victims and villains, all right? Evolving in taking a detour from the proper path that the wheel of evolution is spinning. Nwezube is what happens when someone takes the proper path. Victims and villains are what happens when someone takes the wrong path to evolution. And it is to this that we propose a psychological solution, because of my belief that they constitute forms of psychological disorders. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for that. Emmanuel of Huasia.
Okay, maybe I can, we can take all the questions now, and then I give one direct answer.
Yes. I see Emmanuel of Huasia, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can.
All right, then. I think with this discourse, you've given a very good finality to whether or not logic is prior to ontology. But I'm actually more interested in the ontological part of this discussion concerning the issue of consciousness. You have talked about concepts that deal with evolution, how things evolve from a lower cadre of being to a higher one. But I'd like to know, what is the position of consciousness? What is the origin of consciousness? And how does it translate from seeming inanimate objects into animate ones? This is important because you have proposed a psychoanalytical solution to this problem. And I think psychologists have yet to come to a consensus concerning the nature of consciousness. How would you argue this out, Dr. Jonathan? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We also have Adurag Bemi. Adurak Bemi Isaac.
Hello.
Yes, we
Yes,
can hear you.
good day, everyone. I want
Hello.
to thank Dr. Jonathan for. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, loud
yes.
and clear. Go on.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Jonathan, for your presentation. However, I was just drawn back to your using Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch earlier when you were introducing your presentation. And looking at the genealogy of morals, the idea you are trying to espouse is actually similar to what Nietzsche discussed in the genealogy of morals. So I'm wondering why you said you don't actually agree with Nietzsche's position on the Übermensch, and I think that might be because you may have probably, I didn't get that part clearly, but you may have probably assumed or probably equated the Übermensch, that's Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, with his concept of the last man. I think those are two different concepts. And also, I'm still trying to place my hand on any particular extract of Nietzsche's work where he actually equated, or where he postulated that the Übermensch was an evolutionary stage of man. I really can't see any text linking Übermensch to evolution precisely. And
Thank you.
just also, so I don't know if you could clarify that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jonathan, you have the Herculean Übermenschian task of answering these in 1 minute. You have 1 minute, but I shall give you 1.5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. To the first question, Emmanuel Frasia wants me to give an account of the evolution of life from inanimate matter, okay, from which we get the idea of consciousness as a feature of an organic matter. Well, what I have to tell you, Emmanuel, is that my theory of Nkali and in its the evolutionary matrix of individuals in the zone of existence did not cover that range, okay? And I cannot begin now to speculate on what would the origin of consciousness be in that regard, all right? I worked with I started from the premise that life has emerged as the evolutionary state from inanimate matter. I started from that premise to engage with the further evolution of that life, not in physical form, but in psychological forms, all right? Perhaps I could devote some time to reflect on that and come up with an idea or theory on that. But at the moment, I don't have none. My theory did not cover that. Okay, thank you. For the second person that asked a question, says that I conflated the Nietzsche Supermensch and the last man. That's not correct. All right. The last man of Nietzsche is in the heart. It's not a higher being, it's in the heart. And Nietzsche even used that concept to describe the typical European of his day. Okay, the individual that sits before the television, watches television, eats burger, feels that it's so important that without it, life cannot move on. It is the last man. It is where humanity has ended, the highest evolution of humanity. Okay, Nietzsche says, no, that's not correct. And the last man is actually represents something that is, people cannot be proud, human beings, humanity should not be proud of, and that there's a need for higher intellectual, psychological evolution that peaks at the Übermensch. Okay, that was what I said, and that was what Nietzsche said. I did not say that Übermensch and the last man are the same. No, I never said that. And then you said that you did not see where Nietzsche actually alluded to evolution. I enjoin you to go and read Thus Spake Zarathustra, and you see how Nietzsche tried to account for the evolution of try to move from account for the emergence of life from inanimate this and to account for the continuation of psychological evolution, even though critics of evolution are asking why. If evolution were true, why are human beings not evolving into others? If we evolve from inanimate matter and continue through ape to these Homo sapiens, why is that process not continuing? Nietzsche wants to show that that process is continuing, but at the psychological level, because the physical evolution of humanity may have been completed, but the intellectual one, the increasing sophistication of the human brain that enables human brain to understand the world, its relationship with other beings in the world, and accomplish some of the desirables like happiness and all those things that it wants. It has to continue the mental evolution. And it says the Übermensch is the manifestation of that. What I did not agree with in Nietzsche is that the Übermensch had to isolate itself from the herd. Okay, and Nietzsche was the practical example of this. He tried to live his philosophy. He had come to a point in his life where he had no money, he was not successful with love and relationships, he was so depressed, okay, and he discovered that his relationship with the world is making his life much worse. And he had to think of how to survive and how to grow. The growth is the goal of human evolution. And the human can do that by constant overcoming of his limitations, all right, until he peaks at the Übermensch, the overman, the Superman, okay, who has to primarily isolate himself from the herd to avoid being pulled down by jealous and envious herd, all right? I propose Nizube as an entity that lives amongst the herd, because where is the Übermensch supposed to get the severest and the best of tests required for it to evolve, if not in the herd? If it isolates itself from the herd, how can it reach that type of evolution, psychological evolution it aims at? Okay, there might be the possibility of the individual engaging in internal exchanges of that nature to attain that level of evolution, but we know that those herd that Nietzsche's Überman is running away from are the ones that will dish out the best form of tests that will try the Übermensch his will to power, all right? And that is why I believe that Nizube is a much more feasible and possible goal, evolutionary goal for us humans to attain. All right, what rivals it is what the roboticists are doing to build artificial intelligence that will be able to do what we cannot do, all right? Or what the geneticists are doing to obtain, by their manipulations, create a perfect human being without moral frailties by eliminating certain threats, okay? But those threats to exhibit power, those interests, those beliefs are what the internal mechanism is there to regulate. It's difficult, but we can do it. Okay, if we can do this, we can achieve that evolution organically. And that's my point, where I differ from Nietzsche and where I differ from the scientists. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thanks everyone for your interesting comments and questions. You can react with a clap under the reactions box to share your thank you to our speaker, Dr. Jonathan Chimakonam. Thank you very much, and thanks to the UJ Library team and to everyone involved for this very, very interesting talk. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ashu. And thank you everyone who made out their time to come and listen and view this presentation. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.